Welcome to the 2011 SPJ Town Hall, New Media Turns the Corner. I'm Rose Aguilar, host of Your Call on KALW 91.7. I'm here with my co-host, Hana Baba, to welcome you to what promises to be a fascinating discussion about the changes taking place in journalism today. Tonight's program is presented by the Society of Professional Journalists in collaboration with the San Francisco Public Library and the San Francisco Bay Area Journalists. After several years of difficulty, we're seeing a lot of activity, particularly involving new media organizations. For example, we've seen Patch.com open hundreds of local bureaus across the country. Yahoo is expanding its global news staff, including the addition of a bureau here in San Francisco. AOL agreed to pay $315 million for the Huffington Post. In the Middle East, we saw how citizen journalists are reporting on uprisings in Egypt, Tunisia, Iran, Yemen, and elsewhere. And papers like the San Francisco Chronicle are finding ways to collaborate with groups like California Watch, a young nonprofit that was named SPJ's Journalist of the Year in Northern California. In fact, 2/3 of this year's winners in SPJ's Excellence in Journalism competition were new or nonprofit media, a ratio that would have been unthinkable just a decade ago when newspapers and large TV stations dominated the news media. But to be sure, most of the hard work is still ahead of us. Few news startups turn a profit, many community newsrooms still rely on volunteer labor, and broader economic issues have cut into advertising. We'll examine both the positive and the negative trends with our panel tonight of 10 leading experts in journalism, economics, politics, and education. But we really want to encourage the members of our audience here at the Public Library to drive this discussion. This is your chance to ask these experts what's happening to the news that you depend on to make your day-to-day decisions. Our conversation tonight will include 5 elements. We'll talk first about the quality of reporting available to the public, and then move on to what's being done to create sustainable newsroom jobs. We'll also talk about creating a new system that enjoys constitutional freedom of the press, celebrates the diversity of our communities, and enjoys the economic independence needed to support ethical journalism. And now I'd like to introduce my co-host of this evening, my colleague from KALW, Hana Baba, and she'll be introducing our panelists.
Thank you, Rose. As Rose said, it's very strange for us to stand up here, and we're not used to looking this good. We can go to radio in pajamas. So I'd like to introduce our panelists for today. We'll start up here from the back row. From your left is Kwok-Shu Leong, is executive producer of the daily Mandarin and Cantonese news hours on KTSF-TV in San Francisco. And next to him is Lanita Pace Hinton, and she's Director of Multimedia and Technology Programs at the Knight Digital Media Center at UC Berkeley. Next is Pat Connealy, and he's Managing Director at IDG Ventures SF, a partnership that invests in early-stage new media technology companies. Next is David Calloway, Editor-in-Chief of MarketWatch.com, which is published by Dow Jones and Company, a part of News Corporation. Quan Booth is co-founder and senior community manager of Oakland Local, a nonprofit media site that promotes discourse on public issues. In the front row here next to me is Barry Parr. He is a media analyst who publishes CoastCider.com and was a key developer of the Mercury Center. Next to him is Dr. Dina Ibrahim. She's an assistant professor of broadcast and electronic media at San Francisco State University. Next is Brian Farnham, and he is managing editor for local news at, Brian Farnham is not at Yahoo. Right, he is editor-in-chief of Patch.com, a division of AOL that provides news and information to specific communities, very local. And after him, we have Anthony Moore. He's managing editor for local news at yahoo.com, guiding the company's local coverage nationwide. And at the end there, last but certainly not least, is Senator Leland Yee, who represents San Francisco and San Mateo counties, and he is the recipient of the SPJ's Freedom of Information Award in 2010. That's our panel, and back to you, Rose.
Great. So before we start, I just want to get a sense of who we have in the audience. How many of you currently work in the media? A lot. How many of you used to work in the media? And how many of you want to work in the media? Okay, good. That'll give us a sense of who we're talking with. Great.
This whole row over here, like 2 rows over here.
So on every Friday on Your Call, we have a media roundtable, and we invite an international, alternative, and mainstream journalist to talk about coverage of the week's news. We believe it's really important to highlight good journalism out there because so much of it gets passed over. And we think it's also important to start off on a positive note because from there the criticism usually begins. So with that, I want to start off on a positive note tonight. And I worked with Barry Parr in 1995 at cnet.com. We were on staff before the web was even a mainstream word. And I just want to ask you, Barry, since you were there in the beginning and you've rode the wave. What's really exciting you as we face all of these challenges?
Oh, okay. Well, the good news is, we see an emerging business model for media, and the bad news is it involves giving 30% of your revenue to Apple. But I think there is a lot of potential actually for, building a business, in fact, on top of distribution through mobile. The other thing that we've got going on that I think is really profoundly exciting and far much more exciting than, say, 5 years ago when I started CoSider is that the tools are so much better than they were 5 years ago. They're really profoundly better. And compared to the dark days of 2005, media are now really ubiquitous. Everybody is online. And so Facebook can launch a product like Facebook Comments and really overnight build community on thousands of websites. So there really are some exciting things going on, and really in the last 5 years, things have changed a lot.
And does that excitement also translate to content and the quality of the content?
I don't think we're there yet. I don't think we've seen any digital native content that has produced really groundbreaking journalism. I think there was, a couple of years ago, we were pretty excited, say, about what was happening at a place like Talking Points Memo, where they were doing some really great stuff. We've seen a lot of efforts. But things like Rupert Murdoch's Daily has not really, I think, excited us on a journalistic level, for example. So I don't think we're there yet, but I think we're laying the groundwork for some institutions that may possibly do that in the next 3 to 5 years.
I'm wondering what you think it would take, all of you, what you think it would take for it to go to that next level and provide quality journalism. Yahoo.com, Anthony Moore.
Yeah, I just want to offer a slight difference of opinion there. I think that we're seeing a couple of things happening right now, and they're positive things that are happening. So while it may be true that the sort of first wave of online-only journalism tended to be national and international criticism and opinion, which got the name of blogs, what we actually are seeing at the local level is something even more exciting than that. As newspapers have become challenged, and we've seen, sadly, the destruction of the capabilities of newspapers and local television stations and other media in the local arena, we're seeing a whole new layer of journalism being created at the local level. So startups such as the Bay Citizen here in San Francisco, Texas Tribune out in Texas, there have been some others that have attempted similar things, are starting to use a digital-only medium to provide a layer of local coverage. And add to that, the other positive thing I see is outfits like Patch, which are coming in to fill a void, and Yahoo, which is looking to create a platform where, let's call it semi-pro or citizen journalism can take place. A new layer of journalism, this is stuff that wasn't covered at all before, observational, community-oriented journalism, things that might have been restricted to a email newsletter or, in the distant past, some kind of mimeograph letter. So actually those are positive changes to journalism, and they're happening at the local level now.
Speaking of local, how many here have heard of Patch.com? Okay. It's interesting. Rose and I were speaking earlier, and many people that I've spoken to also, I love my local patch, I must say, with not because you're here, but I follow it. I'm from Union City, and it tells me what's going on in the schools, and it tells me what's going on down the street. But not many people know about it, and I'm wondering why you think that is, or are you targeting certain communities that are covered by Patch now?
And can you describe Patch for those of us who aren't familiar with it?
Yeah, so Patch is a hub for news and information for local communities, simply put. So it goes beyond news, and we can get more into that, but obviously that's something it leads with. And what we do is we hire a full-time professional journalist who lives and works locally in that community that it's serving. So it's a uniform platform, so the technology is shared, but so we can flip a switch, but the editor is really the key to making that all work. So for us, for each of those patches, although it's part of a bigger brand and effort, it really, what matters is how many people within that community know about it. So I'm very gratified that you know about yours, and the question would be how many more people in your community know about it, and the ones who don't, how do we let them know?
Well, I'm also a news person, so that
helps. And obviously the site kind of markets itself to some degree in that the longer the editor is there covering the news, the more people they're talking to, the more people are interested in seeing the photos of the high school football game and will go look for it, that sort of thing. Last year we grew from 30 sites regionally on the East Coast to 775 nationally. We were the largest hire of journalists in the country, something we're very proud of. So we're definitely making an effort at serving those communities, but doing it at scale, and that's been the big challenge of scaling to that size.
Can you elaborate on that? When you say serving the communities, what does that mean exactly?
Well, I mean, we wouldn't exist if there wasn't a feeling that a lot of those communities, if not all of them, don't have the experience online of finding the news and information that's most relevant to them. So, there are a lot of great weekly newspapers. There's a lot of bulletin boards, Facebook groups, you name it. There's a lot of media focused at local, but not every community has it. And even the ones that do often aren't getting the kind of service that I think they used to historically because of downsizing and regional newspapers not serving those communities the way they used to. So you'll have the council meeting not really being covered. We've had numerous examples, and a lot of the patch editors in the room can speak to this, where board meetings, council meetings, things that those members got used to not being covered. Suddenly they were seeing that patch editor over and over again, week after week, and thinking, okay, well, you guys are here to stay, and this is real professional news.
Well, how many in the audience, do you feel like your communities are being covered well? Do you know what's going on in your backyard? Can we get a show of hands? Do you feel like your community is being covered well? Do you feel like your story is being told? So majority no? Okay. Well, Brian, no, I'm sorry. Let's go to Pat with IDG, because you argue that there's a lot of local news in San Francisco based on the data that you've done, and a lot of people feel like they don't know what's going on in their backyard. So can you talk about that?
Sure. We pulled together some numbers about what's actually going on in the .com world in San Francisco, and I stopped counting after 100 local .coms. So you're talking about 14 citywide newspapers have .coms. There are 13 ethnic .coms. There are 16 different neighborhood papers who have .com sites. The high schools, the special interest things, the universities, the TV stations, the radio stations. Together, those add up to 100 units of local coverage, and that's not counting all the new stuff that venture capitalists like we fund all the time in the Valley. So this is at some level a flowering of local journalism that's happened because it's cheap to be in business now. You don't have to have a big printing press and truckers and unions and all those things. You can be right in the business in a way that was impossible in the last 25 years. So I think there's a flowering going on of local journalism, and there's lots of capital chasing that opportunity right now.
Lenita, would you agree with that? When you look at local news, do you think it's being covered well by the sources that were just cited?
I think in the San Francisco area, that's true. That's probably not true in all areas, but we are seeing, like with the development of Patch and many other hyperlocal news sites, that there's a rebirth of coverage of local news.
Okay, thank you. Hi. My name is Michael Leviton, and I was a foreign correspondent for some years, about 5 years in Berlin, writing for Newsweek and LA Times and other publications. Many freelancers like myself have kind of jumped out of the business as it has steadily declined, the financial capacities. My question is, I suppose I'll address Mr. Calloway on the sustainability side. As wealth in America over the last decades, and it's an old story, and we've been hearing it now for many years. People like Paul Krugman have been really adamant about getting us to realize how wealth has been so concentrated in such a minority of folks up in the upper 1% of 1% of America, which runs 20% of the country, something in that area. What strategies could be used to tap this minority of individuals in the way that foundations and charities in the past did? But if we have a few people, and really quite a number of them, who have immense amounts of wealth and would like to do good things with it, why are we not tapping them as the new MacArthur foundations and as the new people who are going to finance this community journalism? There should be a way, a strategy, and a mindset where they can help produce the new public interest journalism of the future.
Well, I think you are seeing that from some of the wealthy. I mean, not every one of those 1% is Goldfinger living on an island, keeping all the money. I mean, you have Bill Gates is doing fantastic things. MSN and MSNBC sprang from Microsoft. Murdoch, for all the criticism he gets, is investing in media and investing in digital media and in innovation. Mike Bloomberg is doing a ton of stuff through media, through his company. They're hiring hundreds of people. I used to work at Bloomberg 15 years ago, and I was over in Europe as a foreign correspondent. There were 40 journalists working for Bloomberg in Europe, and now there are 1,000. So I think it depends on the interest of the certain people, but they are being tapped, and you can get them to lend to foundations and do that type of stuff. It's just creating the bridge from the journalism world into that world, and it's not as hard as you would think in my experience.
I would just say that a few of those individuals you mentioned aren't exactly the examples of the types of progressive journalism that I think a lot of people here are here to talk about and listen about. I mean, the Koch brothers and Murdoch, these guys are kind of villains in a sense of where we want journalism to go. I mean, Fox News and even the Daily, who knows where that's going to go, but they're not necessarily quite what I think a lot of the Bay Area community-interested, public radio, public TV, public press-minded people have in mind.
So that is an opinion that has probably been ill-served, in my opinion, having worked in two of those companies and seen the dedication that they give to journalism. Everyone has their opinion of Fox News, right? Rupert also owns The Australian. Rupert owns Market Watch. Rupert owns The Wall Street Journal, right? So all of these doing progressive things. Bloomberg has sprung from nowhere to create progressive journalism online and through his terminals and in media. So, respectfully disagree on that one.
Think about like ProPublica, for example, California Watch. We feature them on our show regularly, and they're doing excellent investigative work, especially, both of them. Is anyone familiar with those two, and can you talk about just the success and where you see that going? And do you think that we'll see more of these kinds of outlets?
Would you like? I think Pat was raising his hand a little earlier.
I think that paying for news journalism, and especially for news journalism with a variety of political agendas, historically in San Francisco was paid for by real estate and automotive and help-wanted advertising. It wasn't paid for by the circulation, nickels of the subscribers. And I think if you think about government-owned journalism versus the rich, benevolent donors' own of journalism or the public's owning of journalism, I think there's a time now where you don't need quite as much funding as ever. But some of the people who today are seen as barons in the Hearst or the Murdoch or the Bloomberg sense usually started off with a pretty defined journalistic crusade in their mind, and most of the time in their own minds it was progressive. So I think that the dollars are more available than ever for people with an agenda, but the ability to spot the quality voices is a little bit harder now that they're so numerous.
There will always be a market for investigative journalism. And I don't know that it's the type of financial journalism that was referred to before, but I think that there will always be people willing to also spend the time to listen to that type of reporting, or even to read it online. So there is no doubt that that investigative journalism will continue to flourish, simply as longer format journalism. So yeah, I just think that that makes a lot of sense in terms of what the audience wants, and it's probably what is also defined as progressive journalism. I think we really should probably define our terms. What does that really mean? And how is Bloomberg doing progressive journalism? And we may be thinking about different definitions of what that is, and I'm not sure if the segue from that into investigative journalism made a lot of sense, to most people thinking in terms of how that's defined.
Have another question?
Hi, my name is John Osborne. I'm a local freelance journalist here. So a couple years ago when I was doing, I had a friend, we were trying to figure out the feasibility of starting a nonprofit journalism endeavor up in Humboldt County. And I remember coming across this corporate structure that I believe Vermont, maybe one other state uses in the country, but it's called a low profit limited liability company. And it's a structure that's meant to allow for profit, but to also allow for tax-exempt status for donations. And I found this really interesting, and I was really surprised that other states didn't have a similar model. And I remember a couple of commentators also mentioned that this could also be a model to help budding companies in the future by allowing them more flexibility in how they acquire finances. So I'm just kind of curious, both how many of you on the panel are familiar with this type of model, and also, I guess this would be directed towards Senator Yee, how difficult it would be to bring this kind of model to California, as a potential way of, assisting in the future of journalism or any other endeavor for that matter. Thank you.
Senator Yee?
Relative to establishing a new financial instrument or a new financial business, it is possible. I think the question is, what is the need for it? What is the support for it? Who might be able to carry a bill to allow that to happen? I think that one of the selling point is that if in fact this new financial structure can be a impetus for new businesses that will generate jobs, I think you're going to hear a welcome applause for something along those lines. Not something that I've heard of, but clearly something that one can look at, and my office will look into that.
Has anybody heard of that kind of model? Pat? No?
Our panelists that we haven't spoken with yet. Kwan, why don't you talk a little bit about working with marginalized communities? Because the one complaint I hear from people about the sort of corporate media is that they go to the same sources over and over again. I mean, Libya is a great example. Has anybody heard from a Libyan in the last month? Right? An Iraqi, an Afghan? They go to the same people. You can talk about wiretapping, torture, Libya, Twitter not being taxed in San Francisco. I mean, you're an expert on everything. So why don't you talk a little bit about what you do to bring in those voices?
Thank you. So before we talk about how we work with different communities, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the state of online media and just really get specific when we're talking about communities, because that's not one monolithic market. In San Francisco, in Oakland, where we do business, in all the different pockets of the Bay Area, there are tons of different communities that we all serve. And I think we have to understand the nuances and the difficulties of each particular community, because we can't just continue to talk about them as if they're all the same. For example, the online community market in Oakland, it's pretty robust. There's everything from the WordPress and the Blogspot hosted blogs to sites like ours that have grant funding to more advocacy sites, and they all struggle with audience. And these are folks that actually, they serve the marginalized communities. They serve the people that haven't been traditionally served by corporate media, and we still have to deal with how do we work with these communities? How do we let them know that we have their backs, that they're the ones that we're focusing on, because they're so used to being left out of the general media marketplace? And so from a business perspective, how do we target those folks? How do we let them know that they are the community that we're focusing on? And also, how do you actually turn that into a profitable business model? And not profitable because we want to be rich, but profitable because, we have to pay the bills. We want to make sure we can go to work the next day. So that's the question that we deal with on a regular basis. How do we interact with these communities? And we're doing that partially through partnerships with some of the people on the panel, but also through social media trainings, through diversity trainings, through actual media and informal conversations. We do a lot of drink-ups, meetups. We have open offices pretty much 24/7. Whenever we're there, you can come there and talk to us. And we really need to lower the barrier of entry between community media, between media professional and media enthusiast or media consumer. And by doing that over the last year and a half, we've started to see a lot more community buy-in, and we're starting to see the community come to us for stories. But you have to recognize that they are a diverse community. You have to recognize that they're somebody that might have been left out of the usual media stream, and let them know that you understand that, and then they slowly open up to you.
Right. And that's Quan. He's the co-founder of Oakland Local. Just because there are so many panelists, I want to let you know who they work with.
I had a quick question for him actually as well, Quan. So I'm going to play devil's advocate a little bit here. So you cover your local community, and we spoke about local communities and getting local. And so do you feel at all, as a nonprofit, a bit, dare I say, not threatened, but, some kind of competitions come in from the big boys, Yahoo. If we take the gentleman sitting in front of you right here, you were having a nice conversation earlier. I listened in. And so do you see Yahoo going really local, for example? Do you see that as a plus? Or do you see them as competition? Or how do you see that?
Well, first, full disclosure, Yahoo is a content partner for Oakland Local, so they do distribute our content on their website, so everybody should know that. But second, in full honesty, there is some competition. And there is, if we're going to be honest about the situation, some back and forth. Some people are wondering what the corporate entities are going to do in a hyper-local space. And I think it's a valid question. But I do think that there is space for everyone to work together. One of the questions that I'm really interested in hearing about are the corporate entities interested in working with local communities? Because I have to be honest, we've been working with the Oakland community for the last year and a half. And I'm someone who has a background in Oakland activism, and it's still been really difficult for me to get headway, for us to get headway as an organization. So that kind of community involvement, that takes a 24/7 kind of commitment. That's slightly different than a commitment it takes to run a Yahoo News site. So I'm interested in what the challenges are going to be, but I'm much more interested in what the opportunities are going to be to work together, because I think they have their models, we have our models. And if we keep staying in our own specific spaces and not asking how do we work together, then there is going to be a problem. So I think right now we kind of have the opportunity to come to the table and say, how do we work together? Because in another 2 or 3 years, I don't think we're going to have that opportunity, because things are going to be solidified a lot more than they are. So.
And Kwok Shu with KTSF-TV, how do you deal with those challenges in the Mandarin and Cantonese communities?
Rose, can Anthony just respond to that? He wanted to respond to that, and then we'll go.
It's more like just build on what was being said there, which is that actually what we decided to build for local at Yahoo was an open platform. So that's why Oakland Local is a partner of ours. We realized that it's not in our interest to hire somebody in every neighborhood. So what we said was, why don't we build a platform on which the myriad of local content providers that have begun to spring up can ride? And the key here is that they're looking for distribution. I mean, even Patch is looking for distribution. And one thing Yahoo has is distribution. When Yahoo actually provides you with a platform, you realize it, you see it. People talk about it when they see it. The publishers recognize that it's a fire hose. So we've launched, in October, we launched 30 neighborhoods. We're now up to about 400 neighborhoods in New York, San Francisco, San Jose, Peninsula, Detroit suburbs, and Chicago. We're going to be launching in Cleveland and Dallas, end of April, early May. And as we iterate on the product, we're going to get better at it. But the idea is that it's open, and it allows for publishers to publish their content on the platform, people to come and actually communicate and participate on the platform, and then for original content to be written on the platform if you want to do that. So that's the sort of vision, is that the exact reason that you mentioned, which is Yahoo is not going to know Oakland better than Oakland Local. So why not have Oakland Local be that voice, and we provide carriage or distribution?
Rose, you had a question for Kwok Shong?
Yes.
How do you deal with challenges that Kwan described, and are they similar in your community?
Well, at KDSF, we broadcast news on a 7-day basis. 1 hour Cantonese news and 1 hour Mandarin news. The challenges are great. I think they are daunting. It's very hard to overcome. In the past, we are kind of protected by our own language, right? We broadcast in language, and we are the only game in town, so we are protected. But once you are online, that advantage will go away very, very quickly, because those people who go online, everybody is your competitor. Even if you have your language, well, there are hundreds, thousands of Chinese websites. So how do you overcome that? There is no a silver bullet. I think for me, the right thing to do is really to build up your community. You empower your community. You be part of your community, and then people. Sometimes it's not that you have an exclusive story that is only, I reported it, which is great, but it is not going to happen every day. So what are you going to keep your audience or your readers coming back to your site or to your TV station and try to find the news they want? I think it's really up to how you build your community, how you connect and go into your community, make your voice known, make my face known to my community. I think that's once you establish that, it's very hard to break it down, unless I quit or change another job, and then so I think the key for us is really to even further to build up our connection with the community, not just with news, but with all kinds of community service, public service. Help the community to overcome a tragedy. That kind of stuff we are constantly doing. So I have no answer, but this is the way I think we may be going. So coming back to the previous discussion before we enter the room, if there is only one thing that I can do right now, everybody is doing thousands of things on a day, but if I step back one step, if there is only one thing I can do today, what is that thing that I wanted to do with relation to my job? I wanted to make one viewer happy, seeing my report, seeing my stories on our channel. If I can do that one at a time, I think we are doing great.
Hi, my name's Mark Helfin. I used to write for the Palo Alto Daily News, which was at the time something called a hyper-local newspaper, a physical paper, advertising supported. It was very successful at the time. My question is this comment about 100 possible news sites in San Francisco, low cost of entry, low barriers, easy to use tools, no union, on and on and on. I wonder if the diffusion of interest of so many places is going to essentially always make it impossible for any single place to be financially viable on its own, and impossible for professional journalism to exist, as in people can make a living wage as a journalist. Is there so many easy ways of getting so much news out that no single place can actually exist financially? I don't have a particular person, but
David Calloway.
Yeah, it's a great question. When MarketWatch, when I joined MarketWatch 12 years ago, we had a freelance rate of $300 per story, which 12 years ago was viewed as semi-obscene by people who write wrote for newspapers or magazines, which would often pay several $1,000s for a piece. And the thinking, part of it was we didn't have a lot of money. Part of it was the stories had a much shorter shelf life than something on a magazine. And over the course of 12 years, it's gradually climbed to about $500 as we made more money and brought in a stronger stable of writers. People who are writing now for the Huffington Post are getting something like $15. Right? So the market has really degraded from even there. And it's very difficult, if you're a freelance writer, to make money doing that. I have friends who are doing it who are writing 10 stories a day of 100 words each so they can rack up $150 just to get by. But at the same time, the proliferation of sites does make it very difficult for one small site to exist. Right? Our strategy in the old days was to align ourselves with a big media company, CBS. We aligned ourselves with Yahoo in some way and with AOL in another way. So I think whoever you are, you need the types of ventures and the types of connections with more established or at least larger players in order to survive. The other reason is that the proliferation of sites has caused a change in the way people get their news. No longer do they just go to what we call a destination site, which was just essentially a newspaper online, right? They're getting their news on Facebook, and they're getting their news off of Google and Bing and search engines. And so to be out there in that news sphere, you have to have different ways of attacking it and of having connections and distribution arrangements.
Lanita Payson?
Yes. I'd just like to add that proliferation of news sites creates more demand for content, which creates more opportunities for professional writers. And I think before you think about going into news as a business, as an independent publisher, you have to really think about what the need is, if there is a need in that particular space for another site, and then how do you distinguish yourself in the content that you provide. And I wanted to go back to the question about funding, investment in journalism. And I have to agree with the gentleman who raised that issue that there doesn't seem to be a lot of appreciation and investment at this stage in journalism. Our center is funded by the Knight Foundation, which is one of just a handful of organizations that are supporting this kind of transition of traditional journalism into this new age. And we've begun to look at funding from other organizations, and there seems to be an interest in a particular handful of topics, including investigative reporting, business reporting, health reporting, but there is a greater need for just training in journalism to get journalists to understand this new environment that we're working in, and also to educate the broader public about the need and the public good that journalism serves, and why it warrants investment from private investors as well as nonprofit organizations.
Was there another question? Oh, Quan?
Thanks. To the question about the huge influx of .coms and news sites, I think it's partially a question of scale. For example, I know very few hyper-local sites that have a full staff, but I know tons of individual bloggers who get paid to blog, and that's all they do. Or bloggers, citizen journalists, however you want to classify it, but they only focus on specifically small, really targeted niches. This can be the Mission District in San Francisco. A friend of mine runs a site called Halfway to Concord. All he focuses on is Concord conservative right-wing politics. He's been running it for the last 7 years. So I think you really have to know your audience. You have to know specifically what your niche is. And also, don't just look at yourself as reporters. If we're reporters, we're media professionals, look at everything that you have to offer, all of your skills, and see how you can serve that community better. One of the things that we're seeing is we don't think anytime soon that just advertising is going to pay the bills, but we do see a huge need for social media training for people to learn how to do things online, and that's becoming just as much of a needed skill as an ad posted on our sidebar. So we're seeing that we want to serve that community, Oakland specifically, and we're taking all of our skills collectively and seeing how do we stay afloat to do that. Yeah.
We have a number of people wanting to ask you questions, so go ahead.
in the 1800s, Charles Dickens wrote a novel about his trip to America called Martin Chuzzlewit. In it, he encountered number of people with their broadsides, basically very biased newspapers. And kind of we see that today with something like Straight Sheets is funded by a libertarian millionaire, or Beyond Cron, which is funded by Randy Shaw, who recently helped get the Twitter tax exemption through, and he also contributed to Jane Kim's campaign. And we know that the New York Times is biased. We know the Economist is biased. We know the Financial Times is biased. We know the Wall Street Journal is now horribly biased. So we can kind of adjust our lenses for when we read this stuff. But when you're reading something online and you don't know who the person is, it's kind of hard to know whether they're legitimate or not. So, and once these newspapers, if these newspapers eventually disappear and are no longer published in print, they're just competing with everyone else. So how do we know, how do newspapers establish credibility? I mean, you have to be able to go to somebody like, I mean, even I saw this news reporter, he put a piece on YouTube about Gavin Newsom walking away, because when Gavin Newsom gets a question he can't answer, he just walks away from the reporter. And it's a recurrent theme. So if you're a blogger, he's not even going to talk to you. They're not going to return your call. So how do these news organizations that are coming up establish legitimacy, and how can we get it so that we know how the people are able to see the sort of problems with bias that are inevitably going to come up? Because there's also a problem with advertiser. There's a problem with backers. You know, if a millionaire is putting $500,000 or $1 million into a newspaper, he's going to expect something in return. He may not want his coverage to be negative. So there are all these things. So I was wondering if anybody had any general comments about those.
Barry Parr.
Yeah, so that's a really difficult problem, isn't it? If we think about the way that we understand journalism today, it really is an historical aberration that our notion of, objective journalism, in fact, is a product of the monopoly journalism that we had after the Second World War. That's not coming back. Things are really changing. And the truth is, we did have, objective journalism which created shared narratives, but the truth is what we really only saw was that narrative from a particular perspective. Now we've got chaos. And I'm not saying that that isn't a problem, but on the other hand, what we really need to think about is the fact that we do have a lot more voices, we have a lot more information, and we need to, in fact, develop citizens that understand not only how to read a news story and understand it, but also know how to tell a story, understand, how facts work, how confirmation works, how, nonfiction storytelling works. That's a big challenge. And we also need, to develop procedures within the community of journalism in the new media that are as thoroughgoing and really comprehensive about the nature of the practice of journalism for the new media as they were in the newsroom, say 20 years ago.
I think Brian had his hand up.
Yeah, I think one answer to the question of how do we sort of police bias, at least online, is that online news is a conversation, right? That's one thing that is great about it. And so when you're talking about a piece that runs online that people immediately start commenting on, a conversation can spring up instantly about whatever biases they've identified in that piece, and the writer of that piece can jump in to defend the facts or that position. That's not something that's possible in print. So I think there's a built-in keeping people honestness to the online medium. At Patch, we actually, as an experiment, because we're constantly thinking about, first of all, we're middle of the road, we want to report fairly, but we also want to, because we're in communities, be of that community, and as we're asking people to share something about themselves on the site, we want to share something about ourselves. So we ask all our editors in their bios to actually talk about their beliefs. We encourage them to talk about their political beliefs, religious beliefs, as a nod to the fact that we think if you tell somebody your beliefs, you're arming them to spot bias in your piece if they see it. That may not be as big a deal at the local level with a lot of the stories we cover as at larger levels. But again, if you pretend that pure objectivity is possible, you can get in a lot of trouble, potentially.
And let's spend some time talking about holding politicians accountable. This is a really important question. The Columbia Journalism Review wrote a piece in October called Not Watching Sacramento, and they quoted Bob Saladay, who took a buyout from the LA Times, who now works for California Watch. He said there were about 80 full-time reporters and editors in Sacramento in 1999. By 2010, there were only 35. He had a great quote. He said, "This is a state, California, with more than $1 trillion economy, 250,000 state employees, 10,000 schools, the biggest prison system in the country." He said, "There's a lot to cover. There's a lot of room for waste, fraud, abuse, and corruption. With just 35 reporters covering state government, it's very hard to keep up." So, Senator Yee, let me ask you, with so few reporters in Sacramento, what are politicians getting away with right now?
Well, I don't know if we get away with it, but I do agree that the state of California, the people of California, are not served well when we don't have a robust media. The fact is that oftentimes you have reporters who are not as experienced, may not have as many sources, and as a result, they end up being rather superficial in some of their writings, and that is not a good thing. And it's extremely important to have a robust media to hold all of us accountable. I think part of the solution is, in fact, what you hear here, which is a panelist of individuals who are in new media, different types of media, different mediums of media, and I think that is extremely important. I would say, however, that one of the things that is extremely important is that all of these alternative media outlets begin to establish a code of ethical conduct, a code of professional conduct. Because what happens is that if you are just simply giving your opinion, and that's not based on a lot of other confirmation of that observation, you're not doing anybody any service whatsoever. Because I think people tend to kind of look at different news media as really trying to portray the truth, as what is the objective information that is out there. And to the extent that it's not objective, but somehow you create the impression that it's objective, you don't serve the people well whatsoever. So I think it's extremely important that the level of or the quality of the information continues to be at the highest level, regardless of what medium of information.
And at a time when we have a $25 billion deficit and every social service you can name is getting completely slashed, it's so important to have reporters in Sacramento obviously covering politicians, but also covering the activism that goes on that hardly gets attention. There was an incredible disability rights action at the California Republican Convention a few weeks ago. You should all see the video on this. You had people in wheelchairs get on the ground holding signs that said tax the rich, and the convention attendees came and said, get a job. They threw coins on their bodies. They called them retards. And I saw a mention in the Sacramento Bee, but it was very short, and that's all I saw. So we're missing a lot when we don't see that there's a lot of activity going on. There's a lot more than the Tea Party, is what I'm saying, and we just don't see that coverage. So can you talk about what the changes you've seen in Sacramento as just the number of reporters has just been sliced in more than half?
Well, as I say, when you decrease the number of reporters and you don't have as many seasoned reporter, the depth of the information decreases, and that's a serious problem. I think the solution is, in fact, that we've got to accept the economic realities that we have right now, and that is that the normal sort of business model of having print media, that model is not sustainable, and so you've got to begin to reinvent that particular model, and then in its place are these alternative news sources, and so you've got to then ask the question whether or not they themselves can fill that particular role, because we've got to somehow get that information out to the general public.
Do we have more questions?
Hi, my name is Gavin Shelton, and it looks like I may be one of the only people here that doesn't remember what life was like before the internet. My generation has always had it. So I have a question for Lenita and also perhaps Pat. How do you think that news organizations can promote the depth of perspective that comes with longer form journalism to younger readers like me that are accustomed to abbreviated media and mobile media like Twitter and status updates and text messages?
Do you read any long form journalism?
I do, yeah, I do, but I think I'm one of the few. You read it online? Yeah, I do.
Do any of your friends read newspapers?
None of my friends read. So.
So, Lenita, can you answer that?
Well, that is the challenge of online news, developing news for online, is that the younger audiences like yourself are used to receiving information in kind of short bits. And that is part of what we train the journalists, both young and veteran, in our workshops, is to understand how that audience consumption has changed. And we know from studies that long form is something that educated audiences are interested in reading and do read online. Oftentimes, though, time is an issue, so it's about how you serve up that content, whether you serve it up, using a variety of media, whether that be, graphs and interactive maps. And there are a variety of ways now to tell stories and to tell those stories in episodes so that, number one, you drive the person back to your site to continue to consume that content. So that's one of the things that we teach. But you raise a good point in that the audience nowadays, both mature audiences and young audiences, are expecting a different type of product with online news, and that's something that we have to work on training journalists, all journalists, in terms of understanding that and understanding how to use the tools to create this new product for you all.
Anybody else want to try to tackle that up here? Okay, Pat.
I think that media people joke that since Homer, every new form of journalism has been a shorter format and a more real-time format. And I think the history of newspapers to radio to television to the internet to mobile to whatever comes next, the tweet or whatever, is not just a story of shortening formats, but a story of a multiplicity of formats. And the amazing thing I think in San Francisco is not that the Chronicle is still here, but that the Chronicle is still here, and 7 other levels of depth that you want to consume the information at are available to you. And I think that all the old media are investing, today in mobile the way that they were struggling to learn, internet fundamentals even 15 years ago. And at the same time, they're being forced to do that because entrepreneurs who are specializing in mobile are showing them how it's done. So I think that both kids and grown-ups are going to have the chance to read any format they want, and that is a bigger choice every passing year.
And as much as we focus on new media, Dina says it's important to point out that most people still rely on television for their news. Right, Dina?
That's precisely the point I wanted to make. You're not alone. America doesn't read. They don't. If you look at the numbers, the latest numbers in the Pew Center for the People in the Press, or even look at the report on stateofthemedia.org, you will see that well over 60% of Americans will cite television as their primary source of news. Also, more and more Americans are spending more time in transit. So they're either in their cars or they're on public transportation, so they're listening. So the role of radio can't be discounted there either. And but again, there have been many, many ways to try and attract young readers, to long-form investigative journalism. And more recently, have you seen the Vice Guide to Everything? So it's a cross between MTV's Jackass and 60 Minutes. And it's targeted at an 18 to 35 demographic, which a lot of people in this industry are desperately trying to reach. And so that there are a lot of things out there, in terms of investigative journalism that are trying to target younger people that are very, very creative, but just going back to your point about not reading or getting your news online, people are very lazy. You know, a lot of us don't even want to read, don't have time to read. We'd much rather passively sit back and receive information either via video or audio.
Elena, you had something to ask? Let me get behind you a little bit. Sorry.
I just wanted to bring in the aspect of social media in terms of this consumption. We're seeing that with Facebook and with Twitter, these are great drivers of traffic to news sites, and the role that citizens, you yourself, have in terms of informing your network of friends and family about what's important. And we're seeing that people are relying more on individuals for recommendations, or, you know, taking their cues from them about what's important, you know, with those links that you embed in your, you know, Twitter post and in your Facebook posts. You know, this is a way to get people to focus on stories that are important to them as a community, or to them as an individual, or around causes that they're passionate about.
Juan?
Just to kind of piggyback on what Lenita was saying, I think we have to think about, well, rearrange the way we think about news and depth. We might not read 5,000-word stories anymore, but I know I and all of my other friends will read 5,000 tweets that have to deal with one particular issue. One of the reasons that, well, actually the main reason that Oakland Local was started, about 2 years ago, there was a police case where a policeman in Oakland killed a young man. And most of the reporting that came out about that issue, it was in-depth, it was thorough to a degree, but it had a certain perspective. And the conversation was turned into, well, where are the people from these communities? Why don't they read our 5,000-word stories? Why don't they call into our radio shows? And it was a huge question. Honestly, nobody really thought to look too deep into it. But what we noticed was these people were reading, and they were having those conversations, and they were really getting into depth. But they weren't doing it on the Chronicle site. They weren't doing it on the Times site. They were doing it on Facebook, like Lenita said. They were doing it in Google groups. They were doing it, I can't tell you how many text messages I got, day by day, minute by minute, detailing these different issues. And so I think we have to start to look at the different ways that people communicate. And as journalists and as media innovators, media creators, we have to think about how do we shape our stories to fit those new needs. As much as I hate to admit it, we probably aren't going to be reading too many 100,000-word stories anymore, which might not be a bad thing as soon as these new forms of creation come into play.
And I just resubscribed to some long-form magazines because I miss them. But Dina, thank you for bringing up radio. I just wanted to share one positive story at KALW 91.7 FM. We do a lot with very little money, but we needed a couple $100,000 to keep going. So we decided to do a 2-day pledge drive. We didn't offer any gifts, you know, those gifts that you always hear with the books and the DVDs. We didn't offer those. We barely cut into programming. We were just very honest with listeners and said we need to replenish the station. We raised over $200,000 in 2 days. We broke records. We were completely all blown away. We broke records on my show, which is 100% funded by listeners. One day it was about Iraq. The next day it was about the Winnemem Wintu tribe, an Indian reservation up near Shasta. We raised about $4,000 on my show. Usually our average is $2,000. We usually find a big author with a book, and we didn't this time. So it just proves that people really want community, independent radio, independent media. So I just wanted to say that because it's sort of a positive note in a lot of what we're seeing.
Dr. Dina, I think she had one.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add to that is a very unique funding model that happens in public radio, where you have listener-supported content, and that is something we were talking about funding earlier. We're talking about rich people donating, whereas if you had the sort of microfinance model, I mean that's a part of why President Obama got elected as well. So his campaign finance opened it up to everyone to be able to donate, and so I think journalism moving forward can learn a lot from that model. It's an enviable one.
And we got many $5 donations from people who are not working right now.
Hey guys, my name is Luke Stengel. I worked as a journalist for 7 years, and I'm currently a founder of a crowdsourced photojournalism platform called Tackable. 2011 is really the year of the business model. You know, we have the Daily and the New York Times coming out with really prominent paywalls, while Patch believes that they can make money based on advertising. Other local newspapers believe that advertising is not enough to support journalism. So I'm interested in your thoughts on that, Brian. Also, Pat, you know, I know that as an investor, you're looking for 10x, 20x, 30x returns. Is journalism still a good business?
What is 10x, 20x returns?
You know, like I put in $1 million and I get $10 million out.
Okay.
Things we know little about in public radio, Rose.
Exactly.
We don't know what that is. Okay, Brian, but can I ask our guests from now on to keep it nice and brief? We have a long line of people who want to ask questions and little time. Thank you.
Sure. So if the question is about the year of the business model, I guess, or what you're saying, Patch is obviously built on ad revenue, but not in the kind of it's just banner ads or it's just a certain kind. It's really about serving a small community, with what it needs, and there's a business community there as well. Small business owners who need to be served the sorts of ad products online that really benefit them. But taking a sort of the lens out, all of these are good, right? From nonprofit to the different models of profit, where you just have to see you need that variety. And I got an email from Tackable, and I commend you for that. So for the business, I'd love to talk more.
And Pat, you had a question for Pat as well, right?
I think that the business models in media always change, and I think the big one that everybody has seen in their lifetimes is when I was a kid, TV was free across America, and it was completely funded by advertising. And now today, the vast majority of Americans pay a monthly fee to get television. And if the content mix is right, be it hard journalism or entertainment or services, people will pay. And so, all along the spectrum of completely paid to completely ad funded, you see successful things today. And I think one of the crises that we've got right now is that the old model of classified advertising paying for hard news journalism, on paper has broken and it's being replaced. But that business model change has been a constant for 150 years. And there are millions of models that work, and there will be. And capital will chase them because you can get a 10x return, as you described, in all sorts of different ones.
Thank you. So we want to try to get everyone's questions, so if everyone can be kind of brief, please.
Okay. Thank you. My name's Alex. I guess I've heard two major themes here about new media. One, that it has an enormous sort of radical democratic potential and the low barriers to entry. But I've also heard repeated again and again that in order for your model to be successful, in order for your blog or your website to be successful, you have to basically hitch your wagon to a large, well-funded, established media corporation. And so I wonder, in light of that, how new really is new media? And as the dust settles, is not new media just becoming old media as it has always been? And how far have we come from, A.J. Liebling 60 years ago criticizing it, saying, the press is only free for those who own one?
Dave Calloway, would you like to answer that?
It's a great question. And I'm going to go back to the very first question, which was the quality of digital journalism, right? So we are more than 15 years into internet news, and still you hear people say it's coming along, someday it'll be good. Look, quality journalism existed on the internet from day one. It was there. The internet journalists are winning awards from day one. There is a lot of noise surrounding it, which makes it seem worse than, say, your Chronicle, which is a filtered delivery product, right? So quality journalism is there. It exists. The new part of the media really is not the types of stories that are being told, but A, how they're being told, short form versus long form, and B, how they are distributed on your one newspaper or magazine or your one website versus throughout the mobile universe or throughout the internet universe, throughout the portals, AOL, Yahoo, MSN. Do you want to give 30% of your revenue to Apple in order to distribute it? Lots of publishers are making that decision. So it's the distribution, the change from free TV to HBO and pay TV, and the change from kind of free online destination media to mobile everywhere media and the creation of brands there, that is the new part. And that, along with the business models, is what we're all working on.
Sorry, we have to go to the next question. We have to get through everybody. Sorry.
Yeah, my name is Peter Byrne. I'm an investigative reporter, and I want to state unequivocally that I do not write content. I do not write product. I do news reporting. I do not write material to put ads around. There's some assumptions coming from this gathering that I find really troubling. I want to state that many years ago, Upton Sinclair wrote a classic study of journalism called The Brass Check, showing that the advertising model doesn't work. Clearly, it doesn't work. But the main thing that I think is missing from the ingredient of everything everybody's been talking about so far is the consumer. When I read long-form journalism, which I also write, I print it out because I can't read it on screen. Nobody can. You print it out. Print is not dead. And when I mounted an investigation of the Regents last year of the University of California, I crowdsourced it on Spotus and raised $7,000, mostly from individuals, and parlayed it into 6 print journeys in 6 or 7 alt weeklies. It got a lot of national coverage. It got a lot of attention. Leland knows about it, you know, stuff like that. It made some difference in people's lives. And I didn't take a dime from any corporations, okay? So let's talk about how we go back to a model where people who need news, who need investigations, because my duty is not to please corporations, it's to afflict corporations, who need news. You know, let's not bust unions. Let's not be proud, like the man said in the back, that we're moving forward because we don't have journalistic unions anymore. Let's go back to selling the news to people that need it and get rid of the middleman, which in this case turns out to be a lot of publishers, I think.
Quan Booth would like to answer that.
First, thank you for bringing that up. It's a great question. And it gives me the opportunity to talk about 2 things I'm pretty passionate about, 2 Ps, perspective and poor people. Neither one of those things are really beneficial when it comes to becoming a millionaire. Is one magazine, or it's a website now that I've been fascinated with. I'm a big supporter of. I love them to death, called Poor Magazine. Anybody here know about Poor Magazine in San Francisco? Okay. Poor Magazine has existed for at least the last 10 years. They focus on the homeless communities in the Bay Area. Everything they get is donation, and they get very, very, very few donations. They focus on things that get ignored by every other media outlet, and they do it specifically for those people on the streets. A lot of times I read the issues and I might even not relate to them because I'm not homeless. And those are the kinds of stories, those are the kinds of people that I'm really interested in focusing on. But to be honest, those people, they don't pay the bills. They don't have money for advertising. And the perspectives that come from those communities often aren't what foundations want to fund. Let's be real about this. Foundations usually go from flavor of the month to flavor of the month to flavor of the month. And we're funded by foundations, so hopefully I'm not biting myself in the ass here, but we have to be honest. If you're foundation funded, you have to report on what foundations cover. You have to focus on what foundations want, or you're not going to get funded. If you're advertising focused, you have to focus on what the advertisers want, or you're not going to get money. So where is the space for marginalized communities? Where is the space for people who don't have money to fund their own services? Just like the gentleman here, I did a story. It was funded by Spotus about 2 years ago that focused on West Oakland and dealing with asthma rates. It focused on West Oakland. Nobody in West Oakland actually had the money to pay for it, but everyone in West Oakland read it. I know because I actually walked around and handed out paper copies of it. So how do we focus on those organizations and those people who can't do it themselves? And it's really an open question. Sorry to answer your question with a question, but it's something I've been really passionate about lately myself.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Ladin Awad. I'm actually just graduating from high school this year, so I'm probably the youngest person here. I plan to pursue a career in journalism, and like many other people, I get the constant reminders that it's like a struggling field, and I'd be more likely to go into medicine or law if I'm trying to get money. But personally, I'm not too concerned with that right now. I'm just really passionate about journalism itself. And me, like many others, I just want to know, what is it looking like for people like me who plan to pursue a career in journalism in the next 5-10 years? What steps do I need to be taking next, or if there's any steps I need to be taking now, what are they? Tom suggested I direct my question toward Lenita or Dina.
We can start with Dina, SF State. 4 years from now, I believe she'll be out of J school. What's the landscape going to be like?
I think it looks great because you are cheap labor. And there's plenty of room for you to work your way up. I think if you really focus on digital skills that make you stand out from everyone else, you're going to make it. Fundamentally, you need to write well. And if you can do that, then you will be successful in this industry. I honestly believe that there is plenty of room for people who want to pursue careers in journalism right now.
But what skills should they be learning at this point if they're just going into J school?
Well, I agree with Dina that it's the basics of learning how to report and write and how to develop sources in a community, how to put information in context so that your readers can get a sense of what's going on in the world around them. You certainly should learn, and you probably already know how to, do photos and video and basically, how to use all of the social media channels that are available, but I wouldn't really focus so much on those tools because, as Barry said, they're getting easier and easier by the day, and I'm sure in 4 years from now that, that's something, number one, that you're going to get when you go to J school anyway, but you really want to focus on the basics of understanding your role as a reporter in a community. And jobs are becoming available. There's more hiring that's going on right now, and I think that's going to continue going forward.
One question would be, who is a journalist? That fundamental question. Does she have to go to J school for 4 years to be considered that journalist that will be paid? And how can she distinguish herself from a citizen journalist or a blogger? And need there be a distinction? That goes into a whole nother question of who is a journalist. Anyone want to tackle that one? Nobody wants to tackle that one.
We'll have another session for that. You should also visit newsrooms, and talk to journalists about what they do. Thank you.
Hi, go ahead. Yeah, just quickly, Brian?
Yeah, I'll try to be quick. I mean, I think there is a spectrum of journalism, and there are professionals and citizen journalists along that spectrum. But they're all valuable. I think there is value in training. You need to decide for yourself whether that's J school or some other path. I was going to say one of the things you should learn how to do is promote yourself and promote your brand. And figure out, you can get on tomorrow. You can build clips like no other time in history, right? You can do that on Facebook. You can do that on your own website. And learning how to use your networks to promote the things that you care about and want to write about is a huge skill that the internet will allow you to do. So I would concentrate on that among the other things that you need to learn.
Okay, next question.
Hi, my name is Claudia, and I actually work for Patch. But my question is for everyone on the panel. As the nation becomes more diverse, and just noting the lack of Hispanics on the panel, how do newsrooms address in-language content and in-language sourcing, trying to get people in the community, the poor, people, the marginalized, to actually interact with digital journalism?
I'd like to take that one.
Journalists need to know more than one language. It's that simple. I think that it's very, very important to be able to interact with members of your community that you normally wouldn't be able to if you were restricted by language. And that's what I tell my students. I always tell them to minor in Spanish, not just because it will make them better reporters, but it'll also get them jobs in a wider variety of markets. And so I do believe that that is incredibly important. If you don't speak the language, you find somebody who speaks the language and you have them help you. So if you were to try and cover communities, for example, who speak Mandarin or Cantonese and you don't speak a word, I don't think that that's necessarily a limitation, and that should definitely be, I think, part of a journalist's training. And anyone who's bi or multilingual has a better shot at telling better stories.
We're out of time, but if you have any other questions, we can stick around and have an informal conversation. I just want to thank all of our panelists, Quan Booth, David Calloway, Brian Farnham, Dina Ibrahim, Pat Connealy, Kwash Kulung, Anthony Moore, Lenita Pace-Hinton, Barry Parr, and Senator Leland Yee. Thank you all. And thank you all for coming.